She handed the auctioneer a single $20 bill for a piece of cursed, barren land everyone else laughed at. They called her a fool for buying a pile of dead vines and shattered stone. But the mocking stopped forever when she finally broke through the cellar's false wall. The fluorescent lights of the Monroe County Courthouse hummed with a monotonous, soul-draining buzz. Vivian Gallagher sat in the third row of the folding chairs, her fingers anxiously twisting the frayed strap of her canvas tote bag. At 31, her life had become a series of closed doors and final notices, a brutal corporate downsizing at the logistics firm where she worked had left her unemployed, and a subsequent string of medical emergencies involving her late mother had completely wiped out her savings. She was quite literally on her last few $100s, attending the county tax default property auction out of sheer, unadulterated desperation. Around her sat the regulars, hardened real estate flippers, local developers in tailored suits, and aggressive landlords who bought up distressed properties for pennies on the dollar. They had been bidding ruthlessly all morning, dropping $50, $60, sometimes $100,000 on foreclosed suburban homes and commercial lots. Vivian had watched in silence, her assigned paddle, number 42, resting heavy and useless on her lap. She was entirely out of her depth. Then the auctioneer, a weary-looking man named Elias Fletcher, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. He looked down at his ledger with a distinct expression of distaste. "Moving on to Lot 88, Elias announced, his voice echoing in the sparse room. A 5-acre parcel located at the far end of Blackwood Ridge, known locally as the Old Reed Tract. Property includes a collapsed residential structure and the remnants of a pre-war vineyard. The land has been abandoned since 1955. Due to extensive overgrowth, a lack of modern utility hookups, and a recently cleared but historically complex title lien, the county is opening the bid at $20. A collective chuckle rippled through the room. One of the men in a sharp grey suit leaned over to his colleague and whispered loudly enough for Vivian to hear. "The Reed Tract. You couldn't pay me to take that cursed dirt. The soil is basically alkaline chalk, and the cleanup alone would bankrupt a millionaire." Elias Fletcher sighed, holding his gavel limply. "Do I have $20 for Lot 88? Anyone? $20 to take it off the county's hands?" Vivienne stared at the blurry black-and-white photograph projected onto the screen at the front of the room. It showed a chaotic tangle of dead, skeletal grapevines strangling the stone ruins of a collapsed farmhouse. It looked like a set piece from a Gothic horror film. But as she looked at it, a strange, inexplicable pull seized her chest. 5 acres of land. A place that belonged entirely to whoever held the deed. No landlords, no eviction notices, just earth, quiet, and isolation. Before her rational mind could stop her, Vivian's hand shot up. Paddle number 42 hung in the air. The room went dead silent. The businessmen turned around, staring at her as if she had just volunteered to step in front of a moving train. Elias Fletcher blinked, visibly stunned. "I have $20 from Paddle 42, Elias stammered, recovering his professional composure. "Do I hear 30? Anyone for 30? Crickets chirped outside the courthouse window. Not a single person moved. Going once, going twice. Bang. Sold to the young woman in the third row for $20. Less than an hour later, Vivian walked out of the courthouse holding a stamped deed to 5 acres of land. She had paid with a crisp $20 bill from her wallet. As she climbed into her sputtering high-mileage sedan, the reality of what she had just done washed over her. She was broke, essentially homeless, and now the proud owner of a verified wasteland. The drive to Blackwood Ridge took nearly 2 hours, winding through steep, treacherous mountain roads that eventually transitioned from paved asphalt to cracked gravel and finally to deeply rutted dirt. The deeper she drove into the wilderness, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The towering pine trees seemed to lean inward, casting long, dark shadows over the narrow path. When she finally pulled up to the coordinates listed on the county plat map, she cut the engine and stepped out into the stifling afternoon heat. The photograph at the auction had actually been generous. The reality of the Reed tract was far worse. The Vineyard was a sprawling graveyard of gnarled, blackened vines that looked like twisted claws reaching out of the dry, cracked earth. The manor house, whatever it once was, had completely surrendered to time and gravity. The roof had caved in decades ago, and the stone walls were swallowed entirely by aggressive, thorny blackberry brambles. "You're the fool who bought it, aren't you?" Vivienne jumped, spinning around. Leaning against a rotting wooden fence post across the dirt road was an elderly man. He wore faded denim overalls and a wide-brimmed straw hat that shadowed a face weathered like old leather. He was chewing on a piece of dried grass, eyeing her with a mixture of pity and amusement. "Excuse me?" Vivienne asked, taking a defensive step back. "Word travels fast in town," the old man said, spitting a bit of grass into the dust. "Name's Gideon Holt. My property borders the ridge down below. I heard some city girl bought Nathaniel Reed's old nightmare for a $20 bill. I came up to see if it was true." "It's true," Vivienne said, lifting her chin defensively. "I'm the new owner." Gideon shook his head slowly. "County robbed you. Should have paid you to take it. Nothing grows here, girl. The soil went sour 60 years ago. And Nathaniel Reed—" Gideon trailed off, looking past her toward the ruins of the stone house. Well, he wasn't right in the head by the end of it. "Who was he?" Vivienne asked, her curiosity momentarily overriding her anxiety. "An industrialist from the East Coast. Came out here in the late 20s with more money than God. Decided he was going to make world-class wine on a mountain where grapes ain't supposed to survive. He built that house, dug a massive cellar deep into the bedrock. Spent a fortune." Gideon's voice dropped to a gravelly whisper. "But the vines kept dying. Every season, a total loss. By the late 40s, he went bankrupt. Fired all his staff, locked himself in that estate, and refused to leave. In the winter of 1955, he vanished. Cops came up here, found the house empty. No body, no tracks, just gone." A cold chill ran down Vivienne's spine, despite the sweltering heat. "What happened to the property?" "Sat in legal limbo," Gideon replied. "He had no heirs. Taxes piled up for decades. Eventually the house collapsed. But before he disappeared, Old Man Reed did something strange." Gideon pointed a crooked finger toward the massive mound of rubble at the base of the collapsed house. He spent his last weeks hauling massive field stones from the creek, piling them over the entrance to the wine cellar. Buried the doors under tons of rock. Folks around here say he lost his mind, tried to seal away his failures. Others say he was trying to keep something from getting out. Gideon tipped his hat. "Good luck to you, miss. You're going to need it." As the old man ambled away down the dirt road, Vivienne turned back to the property. She looked at the massive mound of jagged grey stones piled high at the foundation of the house. A feeling of dread settled in her stomach, but beneath it, a tiny defiant spark ignited. She had $20 left to her name, no job, and nowhere to go. She couldn't afford to be afraid of a ghost story. For the next 4 days, Vivienne lived out of her sedan. She bought a heavy-duty machete, a pair of thick leather work gloves, and a cheap wheelbarrow from a local hardware store with her remaining cash. From dawn until dusk, she fought a grueling, agonizing war against the neglected earth. Her first goal was simply to clear a path to the ruins, but Gideon Holt's story about the buried cellar doors had taken root in her mind. Why would a bankrupt, desperate man spend his final, agonizing weeks manually hauling tons of heavy stone just to cover a set of doors? If he was ruined, why not just walk away? Her hands became blistered and bloodied. Her muscles screamed in agony as she hacked through vines as thick as her wrists. But the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the crushing reality of her financial ruin. Every stone she moved, every vine she severed, felt like she was clawing her way out of her own personal despair. By the afternoon of the 5th day, her shovel struck something that wasn't dirt or stone. It was a dull, metallic clank. Vivienne dropped the shovel and dropped to her knees, frantically digging with her gloved hands. Beneath a layer of packed, dry clay and crushed rock, she uncovered the corner of a massive, angled wooden door. It was made of thick, weather-beaten oak, reinforced with heavy strips of forged iron. Heart pounding in her ears, she spent the next 3 hours clearing the rest of the debris. By sunset, she had fully unearthed the entrance to Nathaniel Reed's legendary cellar. The double doors were set into a concrete bulkhead that led diagonally down into the earth. But what made Vivienne's breath catch in her throat wasn't the sheer size of the doors. It was the chain. A heavy, rust-encrusted industrial iron chain was wrapped securely through the iron handles of both doors, fastened tight with a massive brass padlock. Vivienne stared at it, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. Gideon's words echoed in her mind. He buried the doors under tons of rock. But looking at the padlock, a terrifying realization dawned on her. The padlock was locked from the outside. Nathaniel Reed hadn't sealed himself inside to die. He had locked the doors, chained them shut, and then buried the entrance to ensure no one would ever open them again. What was he trying to keep hidden? The smart thing to do would be to walk away, to call a contractor, or maybe the local police. But Vivienne was a woman with absolutely nothing to lose. The mystery of the chained doors consumed her entirely. The next morning, she drove into town, traded her mother's old silver locket at a pawn shop for $40, and used the money to buy a 36-inch pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters and an industrial LED flashlight. When she returned to the ridge, the sun was sitting low in the sky, casting eerie, elongated shadows across the dead vineyard. She climbed down into the excavated trench, positioned the jaws of the bolt cutters over the rusted loop of the padlock, and threw her entire body weight onto the handles. With a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the silent valley, the metal snapped. Vivienne pulled the heavy chain free. It fell to the dirt with a heavy thud. She gripped the iron handle of the right door, braced her boots against the concrete frame, and pulled. The hinges screamed in protest, a harsh, metallic shrieking that sounded almost human. A rush of air immediately blasted out from the darkness below. Vivienne choked, coughing as she breathed it in. It didn't smell like rot or death, as she had feared. It smelled like ancient, dry oak, stale dust, and something sharp and metallic, like old copper. She clicked on her high-powered flashlight. The beam sliced through the absolute blackness, illuminating a steep set of stone stairs leading down into the earth. Taking a deep breath to steady her trembling hands, Vivienne descended. The temperature plummeted with every step, the sweltering summer heat instantly replaced by a deep, unnatural chill. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, Her boots touched a solid, poured concrete floor. She swept the beam of her flashlight from left to right. The cellar was massive, easily 3,000 square feet, supported by thick wooden pillars. All along the walls were massive, floor-to-ceiling wooden wine racks, but they were empty. In the center of the room sat dozens of huge wooden fermenting barrels, their iron hoops rusted and their wood warped and split by time. Vivienne walked slowly through the rows, the silence so profound it felt heavy against her eardrums. She checked the barrels. Empty. She checked the racks. Empty. The grand wine cellar of Nathaniel Reed was nothing but a hollow, dusty cavern. A wave of crushing disappointment washed over her. She had spent a week breaking her back, pawned her mother's necklace, all for a literal empty room. Gideon had been right. She was a fool. She turned to leave, but as she swept her flashlight toward the back of the cellar, the beam caught something strange. Vivienne frowned, stepping closer. The cellar was built in a perfect rectangle, according to the foundation lines she had seen above ground. But the back wall didn't make sense. The side walls were made of rough-hewn fieldstone, but the wall at the very back of the cellar was constructed entirely of smooth, uniform red brick. It was a completely different architectural style, hastily mortared, as if it had been added long after the cellar was originally built. She walked up to the brick wall and pressed her hand against it. It was freezing cold. Curiosity overtaking her disappointment, Vivienne grabbed a heavy, rusted iron crowbar she had seen leaning against one of the broken wine barrels. She walked back to the brick wall and tapped the heavy iron against the center of the masonry. Clack. It wasn't a dull thud. It was a hollow, echoing clack. There was empty space behind the bricks. Adrenaline surged through her veins. She stepped back, raised the heavy crowbar over her shoulder, and swung it with all her might directly into the center of the wall. Crack! A spiderweb of fractures shot through the old mortar. She swung again, grunting with the effort. Crack! A chunk of brick dislodged, falling inward with a clatter. Vivienne dropped the crowbar and used her thick leather gloves to pry the broken bricks away, widening the hole. Cold air rushed out of the gap, stinging her cheeks. She grabbed her flashlight, flicked it on, and shoved it through the jagged opening in the wall, pressing her face close to look inside. For a moment, her brain couldn't process what the light was illuminating. It wasn't a wine cellar. It was a vault. Stacked floor to ceiling, in perfect, pristine condition, were rows upon rows of heavy, olive-drab metal cases. But it was what sat on a small wooden table in the center of the hidden room that made Vivienne's heart completely stop. There, resting under a thick layer of dust, was a mountain of dull, yellow rectangular bars, stacked neatly next to a vintage leather briefcase that had burst open at the seams, spilling bundles of pristine, banded currency onto the floor. Nathaniel Reed hadn't failed at making wine. He had never been trying to make wine at all. Vivienne swung the heavy iron crowbar repeatedly, her muscles burning with a fierce, frantic energy. She shattered the remaining bricks, tearing them away with her thick leather gloves until the jagged hole was large enough for her to squeeze through. She stepped over the rubble, raising her high-powered flashlight into the freezing, stagnant air of the hidden vault. The beam of light illuminated a reality so utterly staggering that her knees nearly buckled. This was no ordinary wine cellar. It was a subterranean fortress, a beautifully preserved time capsule of organized crime. Vivienne approached the central wooden table, her breath pluming in the icy air. She reached out with trembling fingers and brushed the thick grey dust off one of the dull yellow bars. It was impossibly heavy, cold, and stamped with the unmistakable insignia of the United States Treasury, dated 1928. It was solid gold. There were at least 50 bars stacked in a neat, unassuming pyramid. Beside the gold lay the burst leather briefcase. Vivian picked up a banded stack of currency. The bills were crisp, $100 gold certificates, perfectly preserved in the dry, oxygen-deprived environment. But the true scale of Nathaniel Reed's secret lay in the olive-drab metal cases lining the walls. Vivian unlatched the nearest crate and threw open the lid. Inside, packed in dry straw, were rows of glass bottles containing a dark amber liquid. The labels were pristine. It was pre-prohibition bourbon, distilled in 1912. Suddenly, her flashlight beam caught a small, leather-bound ledger resting beneath the burst briefcase. Vivian opened it, gently turning the fragile, yellowed pages. It was a meticulous accounting book, but the names listed alongside the massive financial deposits were what made her blood run cold. She recognized them from history books: Meyer Lansky, George Remus, the notorious king of the bootleggers, Enoch Johnson. Nathaniel Reed had never been a failed winemaker. The entire vineyard, the massive estate, the dead, alkaline soil. It was all an elaborate, meticulously funded front. Reed was the premier money launderer and stash keeper for the most dangerous organized crime syndicates of the Prohibition era. He had built this impenetrable vault deep in the mountains to hide untraceable treasury gold and illegal liquor reserves from federal agents. When the mob empires began to crumble and his associates were violently assassinated or imprisoned, Reed panicked. Paralyzed by the sheer terror of the syndicate coming to silence him, he had sealed the vault, locked the cellar, and vanished into thin air, leaving the treasure entirely forgotten beneath the dead vines. I always knew the old ghost stories had some truth to them. Vivian spun around, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Standing in the jagged brick opening, holding a heavy black revolver, was Elias Fletcher, the county auctioneer. Elias stepped into the vault, his polite, weary facade completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating greed. He looked around the room, his eyes widening as they locked onto the gold bars and the stacks of vintage currency. "You followed me," Vivian whispered, instinctively backing away from the table. "I've been monitoring this cursed ridge for 15 years, Miss Gallagher," Elias sneered, aiming the revolver squarely at her chest. "As the county property liquidator, I knew the legend of Nathaniel Reed's missing fortune. But the estate was 5 acres of impenetrable bedrock, poison oak, and collapsed masonry. Finding the entrance would require massive manual labor. I couldn't bring in heavy machinery without alerting the state tax board, and I certainly wasn't going to break my own back digging through the dirt." He took a step closer, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "When I saw you at the courthouse, desperate, broke, practically begging for a miracle, I knew you were the perfect pawn. I let you buy the deed for a $20 bill, knowing your sheer desperation would drive you to do the grueling excavation work for me. And look at you. You actually found it." "This is my property," Vivian stated, her voice shaking but laced with sudden, fiery defiance. "I hold the stamped county deed. Everything on this land belongs to me." "A technicality," Elias laughed coldly. "A tragic accident is about to occur down here in the dark. A structural collapse. Then the county will reclaim the land, and I will quietly empty this vault. Step away from the table, Vivian. Your little $20 adventure is officially over." Vivian stared at the barrel of Elias's revolver. The heavy air of the vault felt suffocating. She was entirely alone, deep underground, facing a corrupt official who was fully prepared to bury her alongside the syndicate's gold. But she had survived corporate collapse, crushing medical debt, and near homelessness. She had clawed her way through the hardened earth with her bare, bleeding hands. She was not going to die in the dark. "You're right," Vivian said quietly, slowly raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I can't fight a bullet. Take the gold, Elias, but you should know. You're not the only one who knows I'm down here." Elias paused, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "You're lying. You have no one. I ran a background check on you before I approved the deed transfer." "I don't have family," Vivian agreed, taking a subtle totem calculated half-step to her left. "But I do have a neighbor, an old man named Gideon Holt. He caught me digging up the doors yesterday. He knows exactly where I am, and he saw your truck pull up the mountain pass." Elias's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second toward the brick opening behind him, momentarily distracted by the mention of a witness. That single heartbeat of hesitation was all Vivian needed. She didn't run toward the door. Instead, she lunged forward, grabbing the heavy burst leather briefcase from the table and hurling it directly at Elias's face. A massive cloud of century-old dust, decayed leather, and loose $100 bills exploded into the air, completely blinding him. Elias shouted in surprise, his finger jerking the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined stone space, the bullet ricocheting violently off the brick wall, but it missed Vivian completely. Using the distraction, Vivian dropped to the floor, swept her booted foot out, and struck Elias hard behind the knees. The auctioneer collapsed backward with a heavy grunt, his head cracking against the solid concrete floor. The revolver clattered away into the darkness. Vivian didn't wait for him to recover. She scrambled over the rubble, diving through the jagged hole in the brick wall and sprinting across the massive, empty expanse of the main cellar. Behind her, she heard Elias cursing, scrambling blindly to find his weapon. She reached the stone staircase, her lungs burning as she vaulted up the steps 2 at a time. She burst through the wooden double doors into the fading evening light, gasping for the fresh mountain air. Turning quickly, she grabbed the heavy iron handles of the cellar doors and slammed them shut. She snatched the thick iron chain she had cut earlier, looped it tightly through the exterior handles, and jammed the heavy steel shaft of her crowbar through the chain links, wedging it securely against the concrete bulkhead. Below the earth, she heard Elias slamming his fists against the thick oak wood, muffled shouts of fury echoing up through the soil. He was trapped inside the very vault he had tried to steal. Vivian didn't panic. She didn't flee into the woods. Instead, she walked calmly to her rusted sedan, picked up her cell phone, and bypassed the local police entirely. She dialed the direct regional field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, reporting an armed assault by a county official, and the discovery of an illegal Prohibition-era syndicate stash. Within 2 hours, the ridge was swarming with federal agents, armored vehicles, and state police. Elias Fletcher was dragged out of the cellar in handcuffs, his career and freedom destroyed in a single evening. But the true battle was just beginning. The state immediately attempted to seize the vault's contents, claiming the gold and currency were illicit contraband. But Vivian was prepared. She hired the most ruthless, high-powered antiquities attorney in the state on contingency. Her lawyer argued a brilliant defense using the law of fines. Because the county had aggressively sold the property to Vivian with a cleared title lien, explicitly stating the government surrendered all claims to the estate, and because Nathaniel Reed died with no heirs, the abandoned property legally belonged to the deed holder. Furthermore, The Treasury gold was older than the 1934 Gold Reserve Act, making it legally classifiable as historical collector bullion rather than restricted Federal reserves. After a grueling, highly publicized 8-month legal war, a federal judge slammed his gavel in Vivian's favor. The syndicate's stash was legally hers. Vivian Gallagher auctioned the pristine, pre-prohibition bourbon to elite private collectors for an astronomical sum. The vintage gold certificates were sold to numismatic museums, and the Treasury gold was legally liquidated through a private brokerage. In total, the buried contents of the dead, alkaline Vineyard, netted her just over $14 million. She never sold the land. She hired a crew to finally clear the dead vines, rebuilt the stone manor overlooking the sweeping mountain valley, and spent her evenings sitting on the porch, a wealthy, untouchable woman who had literally struck gold with her last $20 bill. Did Vivian's incredible $20 gamble leave you utterly speechless? Sometimes the greatest treasures are buried right beneath our feet, waiting for someone brave enough to dig. If you loved this wild journey from rags to unimaginable riches, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this unbelievable true story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more mind-blowing historical mysteries and real-life hidden treasure dramas. Tap the notification bell icon so you never, ever miss out.